Chapter 24 of The Silk Stocking Murders by Anthony Berkeley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The trap is sprung. The party from Scotland Yard was the first to arrive the next morning, for Roger had asked them to come at 11:30, whereas the rest were not expected till 12 o'clock. It was with an air of disapproving amusement that Chief Inspector Moresby, Superintendent Green, and the Assistant Commissioner himself greeted their host and consented to imbibe the glasses of old pale sherry which he had prepared to soothe their feelings. "Now remember," he said, having seen a portion of the sherry safely down on its soothing path, "remember that you're here quite unofficially. It isn't because you're from Scotland Yard that I've asked you to come and watch my little cat and mouse act. Nothing of the kind. It's simply because Sir Paul Graham, Mr. Green, and Mr. Moresby are friends of mine, and I thought I'd like to have them to my party." "Humph," said Superintendent Green, unsmiling. "Ah," said Chief Inspector Moresby, smiling. "Sheringham, you're incorrigible," said the Assistant Commissioner, also smiling. "But I don't approve, you know." "And on the other hand," Roger retorted, "you don't disapprove because you don't know what on earth I'm going to do." "Well, what are you going to do?" asked Sir Paul. "That," said Roger, "is just what you don't know, isn't it? Have some more sherry." He refilled the glasses to a refrain of politely protesting murmurs which he disregarded, as indeed their makers fully intended him to do. "Well, anyhow," persisted the Assistant Commissioner, "what do you want us to do?" "Just sit still and look on at the little drama Miss Manners and I are going to perform, and above everything, not interfere by so much as a grunt till I show I'm ready for you. I warn you, you'll find it a ticklish business to sit still and say nothing, but I want your 3 promises to do so, even though you think I'm killing Miss Manners under your very eyes. Do you agree?" "I don't like this," said the Assistant Commissioner uneasily. Roger became as persuasive as he could. This, he knew, was the moment upon which everything depended. If Scotland Yard refused its presence, the whole plan became useless. He pointed out with all the eloquence at his command that any methods were admissible in such a case, unorthodox as these might seem, and that Scotland Yard was not being invited actively to cooperate, but merely to sit aloof and step in only if they cared to do so, and he pleaded pathetically to be allowed just this one chance of saving Jerry Newsom from arrest and the police from the blunder of arresting him and of proving a fantastic theory of his own which they would simply laugh at if he were to voice it prematurely. In the end, Sir Paul consented. It was the argument concerning Newsom which probably brought him to agree to grace this unconventional scene with his own presence and that of 2 of his chief officers, for Sir Paul was by no means as convinced as were the 2 officers that Newsom was the man they wanted. Like Roger, he simply could not see him in the role, and the circumstantial evidence, after all, though nearly always infallible if strong enough, is not invariably so. Much relieved, Roger emptied the bottle among them and proceeded to give them their instructions. Moresby and Green were not to be in evidence at all. They were to lurk behind a screen which had been drawn across a corner of the room, and only come out when Roger called for them. The Assistant Commissioner was to be introduced, if any introduction was necessary, as Mr. Blake, and his connection with Scotland Yard not revealed. He would sit in a dark corner and make himself as unobtrusive as possible. Would he do that? He would. "Well, Mr. Sheringham," said Chief Inspector Moresby jovially, "we shall expect some startling results from you after all this." "I think you'll be startled, all right, Moresby," said Roger. Superintendent Green continued to say nothing in a very masterly way. Even Roger's excellent sherry had not softened that dour man. Except while actually imbibing it, his face was eloquent of his opinion that of all the time-wasting silly businesses, this was going to be the silliest and waste the most valuable time. Superintendent Green, it was clear, was not going to be an appreciative audience. Having completed his arrangements, Roger called in Anne and introduced her. "Now, Anne," he said in businesslike tones, "I want you to tell these 3 doubting Thomases that you are doing this of your own free will, that you fully understand the risks you are going to run, even to the extent of losing your life, and that you don't want them to interfere with what I'm doing to you until I myself give the word." "That is so," Anne agreed gravely, "and I should like to add that even though I knew it meant certain death, I think I should still go through with it because I am sure that if necessary one life should be sacrificed to save the others that this man will certainly take if he's not caught, and also that if Mr. Sheringham had refused to carry out his plan with me after consideration, because he thought it too risky, I should not have rested until I'd found somebody else who would." There was a short silence after Anne had spoken. Even Moresby looked more or less serious. "It is a fact, then, that this scheme involves real danger to Miss Manners' life?" asked Sir Paul uncomfortably. "The gravest," Roger assured him. "Then I suggest," said Sir Paul, "that for your sake she put in writing what she has just told us." "That's a very good idea," said Anne with equanimity. "I'll go and do it at once." The assistant commissioner, who had entertained vague hopes of frightening her out of this harebrained business, looked nonplussed. Anne went out of the room. "You realize, Sheringham," said Sir Paul, "that what she said doesn't make the slightest difference legally. If you do cause the girl's death, you will be responsible in the usual way." Roger nodded. "Oh, yes, I know that, of course, but I thought you'd like to hear her own opinion. By the way, I've been guilty of a gross dereliction of duty. It will interest you gentlemen to hear that although I haven't yet reported it, Miss Manners was attacked yesterday by this brute and very nearly lost her life then." He gave the details briefly and answered such questions as the 3 asked him. "Newsom," said Chief Inspector Moresby without hesitation. "Newsom, of course," grunted Superintendent Green in disgust. "Really," said Sir Paul, almost convinced in spite of his feelings, "it does look as if Newsom is the man." "So Plato said," agreed Roger equably, "and yet he isn't, you know." "And you really think you know who it is?" "I'm convinced of it, but this business will prove once and for all whether I'm right or not, and it's the only thing that will." He handed to Sir Paul an ordinary envelope, sealed. "By the way, here's the name of the man I suspect. Put it in your pocket and don't open it till the show's over. I should hate you to say afterwards that I'd been afraid to commit myself in advance." Sir Paul took it with a slight smile and stowed it away in his breast pocket. "And now," said Roger, "I think you'd better take up your positions. The others will be arriving at any minute." They had been so far in Roger's study. He now led them across the hall into the sitting room. This was a room of tolerably large dimensions, long and not very narrow. There was a window in one end and 2 in one of the sides. The door opened in the middle of the end wall opposite the window. Across one corner at the window end the screen had been placed, and in the other corner was Sir Paul's chair. Roger saw them into their places and then drew the curtains halfway over all the windows so the 2 corners were thrown into shadow. He had only just completed these arrangements when the front doorbell rang, and he excused himself. George Dunning was the first arrival, puzzled but good-humored as ever, and Roger took him at once into the study, where Newsom had now materialized from his lurking place in Roger's bedroom. In the spare bedroom, Anne was completing her document, a little frightened now, but determined not to show it, and watched over anxiously by a far more frightened Moira, who was under orders to stand by to render such first aid as might prove necessary, but otherwise to put in no public appearance. In the study, Roger, Newsom, and George Dunning were exchanging stilted conversation, the last far too well-mannered to ask what on earth the strangely urgent invitation he had found waiting for him when he got home on the previous evening might portend. The next arrival, however, Sir James Bannister, was less diffident. "Mr. Sheringham?" he asked as Roger opened the door to him. His man had been sent out for the morning. "That's right," Roger agreed cheerfully, allowing him to enter. "I received a message from you asking me to call here this morning on a matter affecting not only my personal honor and reputation, but my actual physical safety, Mr. Sheringham," said Sir James weightily. "These are serious matters, sir. May I ask you to explain yourself?" Certainly, Sir James. Take off your hat and coat and come inside. I shall explain things to you in a few minutes." Sir James raised his heavy black eyebrows, but consented to do as he was requested. Roger took him at once into the sitting-room and sat him down on one of the semicircular row of chairs which had been set out across the end of the room facing the door. Newsom, as had been previously arranged, brought Dunning in at the same time, and the two of them took other chairs. It was now a minute or two past 12 o'clock, and the rest of the audience arrived almost together. The first, a stranger to Roger, in a beautifully cut blue overcoat, the effect of which was marred only by a too bright tie and a pair of patent leather boots with cloth uppers, proving to be the great Billy Burton himself, most popular of whimsical stage humorists, whose yearly earnings amounted to just about 5 times as much as the Prime Minister of his country. Almost on his heels came Arnold Beverley, and with him Pleadle. The last Roger detained for a moment in the hall. "Haven't got time to go into it with you, Pleadle, but I want you to back me up. I couldn't get hold of you last night, but I think I'm on the verge of great things. All I want you to do is to sit tight. You'll see my idea in a minute, and remember that all the responsibility is mine. Come along, and I'll show you where to sit." Pleadle looked surprised, but there was no time to explain anything further, and Roger hurried him into the only vacant chair at the end of the ark, just in front of the corner where Sir Paul was sitting. "Be ready to back me up if I want you," he whispered, a little anxiously. Stepping past him, he dropped a note unostentatiously in Sir Paul's lap before making his way to the middle of the room. Roger drew a quick little breath as he glanced at his audience. Among those 7 men facing him was, he felt utterly convinced, the callous but unbalanced brain that was responsible for the deaths of at least 4 girls, and was probably planning already the murder of others. And now the crucial moment had arrived, by which he was to stand or fall. Roger was not often nervous, but his heart beat a little irregularly as he thought of the tremendous responsibility which the next few minutes must bear. "Gentlemen," he said in an ordinary conversational voice, "most of you know why I've called you together this morning so urgently. Let me explain. You may have seen in the newspapers recently the reports, from time to time, of a novel form of suicide in which the victim, always a girl, hangs herself with one of her own stockings. Quite unofficially, I've been looking into these cases in an amateurish way, and the conviction has been forced upon me that they are not cases of suicide at all, but of murder. If this is the case, gentlemen, a very serious state of affairs has arisen. In the middle of our community there is a man at liberty with a brain so unbalanced that his supreme joy in life is the killing of defenseless girls. He is worse than a homicidal maniac, for in all other respects he may be quite sane. I will not trouble you now with the way in which this conclusion has forced itself upon me, though I shall be ready to give anybody any information on this point later. But the important thing is that there is not a jot of evidence in the legal sense to support it. Not one jot. I am therefore, as you will see, in a very difficult position. I know that these deaths are not suicides, but murders, but if I went to Scotland Yard and told them so, they would, on the only kind of evidence I could produce, simply laugh at me. It has therefore occurred to me to form a committee of respectable citizens drawn from representative lines of our national life to relieve me of the responsibility of my knowledge and consult as to what should be done. You, gentlemen, are the committee I have, quite gratuitously, selected. It is up to anyone to refuse to have anything to do with it, as I need not say. But first, I ask you to hear me a little further." Roger paused and moistened his lips. The audience were quite still, and their intense interest was evident. "To discover the means by which these unfortunate girls met their deaths has necessitated a long and arduous inquiry," he resumed, encouraged. "The many details had to be worked out or deduced each by itself. Much had to be imagined. Much was only brought to light after weeks of work. To explain all these steps and enumerate the various points in detail would take far too long. I therefore propose to give you here and now a representation of how this man goes about his work. I warn you, the thing will not be easy to watch. It is my intention to bring home to you the gravity of the state of affairs by showing you exactly how these girls have died. There will be no faking or rigging. A lady has kindly placed herself at my disposal, and I am going to bring her within an inch of death before your very eyes. And I should tell you that, so strongly does she feel on the subject, that she has told me that if the experiment results in her actual death, as I am bound to confess that it may, she will consider the sacrifice worth while if only public opinion can be stirred up to hunt this brute down. That is all I have to say, except to ask you to sit absolutely still and silent while the representation is being performed, and to remember that any well-meant attempt at interference when matters have reached a critical stage will almost certainly have the opposite effect and result in causing the lady's death. Please use every ounce of self-restraint you possess." As Roger had anticipated, murmurs of protest rose the moment he had finished speaking, but disregarding them, he went to the door and threw it open. At once, Anne walked in, pale but perfectly collected. Roger had coached her well in the time at his disposal, and she began to speak at once. "I want to add to what Mr. Sheringham has said," she said, in her rather precise tones, "that the responsibility for what is going to happen is entirely mine. I want nobody to interfere or do anything at all except sit quite still, even if I scream for help or seem to be quite at my last gasp. If you do, you will spoil everything. Thank you. I'm quite ready, Mr. Sheringham." Roger turned to the audience. "What you are now going to see," he said, "is an exact replica of what must have happened each time one of those girls died. You must imagine that you are in the room of a flat belonging to one of the girls." He hurried out of the room. Anne picked up a book and, seating herself in a chair, began to turn the pages. In a moment, Roger entered the room again, and she jumped up. "Why, hello, Mr. Sheringham," she said in a pleased voice. "You're quite a stranger." They shook hands. "I was passing," said Roger, "and thought I'd like to look in and see you." "Where's Phyllis?" "She's gone out to do some shopping, and then she's going on to lunch with a friend." "I see. You're all alone then?" "Yes, quite." "Good. I was wondering if you'd come out and have some lunch with me, perhaps. You haven't any engagements or anyone coming round to see you?" "No, nobody. I'm quite free till the theater this evening." "Excellent. Well, what about getting your hat on and coming out?" "Yes, I'd love to. Will you wait here?" She turned towards the door, and Roger drew a black object from his pocket, shaped not unlike a small pestle, and concealed it behind his back. "I'll open the door for you," he said, following Anne. "Thank you." She stood aside while he opened the door. "I won't be a minute," she said, and began to walk out. Immediately her back was turned, Roger made believe to strike her on the back of the head. Without a sound, she sank back, and he caught her in his arms, lifted her off her feet, and laying her on a settee nearby, tiptoed to the door. A little gasp had sounded from the audience as Anne collapsed, but a tense silence now prevailed. With infinite caution, Roger stole just outside the room and stood for a moment listening. Then, drawing a small hook from his pocket, he screwed it quickly into the top of the further side of the door, opening the latter wide so that the audience could see exactly what he was doing. Closing it again, he walked over to the settee and, slipping off her shoes, began to unfasten one of her stockings, which were of pale-colored silk. Stripping it from her leg, he proceeded to tie the two extreme ends tightly together, testing the strength of the knot with his knee. He placed the loop over her head so that it was lying loosely round her neck, and put the shoe back on her foot. Somebody in the audience pushed a chair back sharply, but otherwise there was no sound. Taking no notice of them without even a glance in their direction, Roger picked up a chair and placed it squarely in front of the half-open door, its back towards the door, shifting its position as if at some pains to get it exactly right. Satisfied at last, he strolled back to the settee, his hands in his pockets, and again stood looking down at its occupant. Anne began to show signs of returning consciousness. She moved her head more freely and made little fluttering motions with her hands. Immediately, Roger picked her up and carried her over to the door. There, amid a tense silence, he propped her in such a position that she was half sitting on the chair back, her feet on its seat, and holding her there, he gave the loop round her neck 3 or 4 twists, passed it over the top of the door, and slipped the other loop so formed over the hook. Then he lifted her up in both arms, pushed the door shut, and dragging the chair up to it with his feet, replaced her in the same position as before. But now that the door behind her was firm, she could be so balanced as to remain there without being held. He stepped away from her. Slowly, Anne's eyes opened, and she gazed round the room as if dazed. Her hands gripped the chair back under her. Her lips fluttered. She seemed to be trying to speak. Roger waited till it was clear that she had practically recovered all her faculties, then darted forward and, lifting her up, kicked away the chair. "Darling Anne," he whispered, his face as white as hers, "be brave, my dear." And lowering her with slow deliberation, he stood back, her head well above the top of the door, her feet at least 18 inches above the floor. Anne hung by her neck. A little choking cry had broken from her as Roger lowered her, but now she was plainly incapable of uttering a sound. There were stifled noises from the audience. Some were leaning forward in horror. Others had half risen. A voice, low but authoritative, said, "Keep still, everyone, please." It was Newsom, who had risen from his chair at the other end of the ark from Plato and was standing with his back to the screen, his face deadly pale, but gallantly doing what he had been told. All eyes were fixed upon Anne in horrified fascination. She had been hanging there only a few seconds, but already her face was crimson and contorted. The veins were swelling rapidly as if they were going to burst through the skin. Her lips were drawn back in a hideous grin. Her feet scrabbled on the door as if trying desperately to find some lodging place. One hand was tearing at the stocking round her neck, the other clutching at the air in front of her. It was a horrible spectacle, and normal flesh and blood could hardly bear it. Everywhere there was the sound of chairs falling as their occupiers pushed them back in rising. Cries of protest began to fill the room. Though he was trembling himself in every limb, Newsom had to restrain Sir James Bannister by sheer force from rushing forward. Disregarding entirely the din, Roger strolled forward nonchalantly, his hands in his pockets, towards the corner occupied by Sir Paul. In front of the latter still sat Plato, the only one still remaining in his chair. "That's how you do it, Plato, isn't it?" Roger asked easily. Plato looked up at him with bright, mad eyes. "No," he said in a thick voice, "I hold them up every now and then, to stop them." He broke off abruptly. "Hold him, Graham," shouted Roger, and hurled himself towards Anne. Just as he reached her, the convulsively struggling body went suddenly limp. End of Chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Silk-Stocking Murders by Anthony Berkeley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Round the Good for X. Roger leaned back in his chair and drew in 2 or 3 satisfying lungfuls of smoke. So the good old French method of reconstructing the crime in the presence of the suspected person can claim one more triumph, he said. It's a pity Scotland Yard is so conservative, isn't it? For all that, Mr. Sheringham, observed Superintendent Green, conservative methods pay all right in most cases. But they never would have in this, Roger retorted, and so I've said from the very beginning, haven't I, Moresby? You have, Mr. Sheringham, Moresby agreed. He could not help himself. Roger certainly had said that, more than once. It was 3 o'clock, rather more than 2.5 hours after Pleadle had been removed, raving and struggling from the Albany, and a quartet was sitting in Roger's study composed of the triumphant novelist himself, the assistant commissioner, and the 2 officers in charge of the case. In the next room, Anne was still lying down after her ordeal, with Moira holding one of her hands and Jerry Newsom the other, completely happy in the vindication of the desperate plan in which she had played so gallant a part. Her lapse into unconsciousness had been but momentary. Although it seemed hours at the time, her period of suspension had actually been only 40 seconds, according to Roger's wristwatch, and her recovery considerably more rapid and less unpleasant than on the previous day, when she had had a severe blow on the head to contend with as well. The terrible shock of realizing himself unmasked before all those witnesses had toppled Pleadle's brain, merely balanced on the verge as it had been, finally over into the abyss of complete insanity. In his own financial line, he had been a genius, and genius being already abnormal, the curtain between it and the more ultimate abnormality of madness is always thin. In Pleadle's case, it had always been not merely thin, but ragged. A severe shock at any time and of any sort, such as financial disaster, might have sufficed to tear it down altogether. And now that the shock had come, down it had gone. A general sigh of relief had gone up when the fact became realized. It was far the best thing that could have happened, for had Pleadle remained sane, repudiated his confession, and pleaded not guilty, it was still a little doubtful whether he could have been convicted on such actual evidence as there was against him. The assistant commissioner, in his relief generous without stint of praise and congratulations, had stayed to lunch in the Albany, and now the 2 officers, their prisoner safely disposed of, and the formalities duly performed, had come back to listen to their amateur colleague's story. To them, no less than to the assistant commissioner himself, the identification of Pleadle with the maniac they had been hunting had come as a complete and paralyzing surprise. And we can't say that you were watching them all and hit on him as the most likely, Mr. Sheringham, Moresby admitted, because you'd written his name in that envelope you gave the commissioner beforehand. That's why I gave it him, Roger grinned. I knew you'd say something like that if I didn't. And Mr. Sheringham dropped a note on my knee at the beginning, telling me to keep an eye on Pleadle, too, Sir Paul added. I was afraid he might get violent, Roger explained. That's why I put you in a place of vantage behind him. When did you first begin to suspect him, Mr. Sheringham? Asked Superintendent Green. The superintendent had thawed considerably since 12 o'clock, but it was evident that he still considered an amateur had no right at all to succeed where the Yard had failed. Yesterday afternoon, Roger replied, after the attack on Miss Manners. That's all. I won't say he hadn't crossed my mind before that, but never really seriously. And when I did come to consider him seriously, of course, I soon became positive. The more I thought about it, in fact, the more obvious it became. And I knew the real criminal, whoever he was, must have a key to Newsom's front door, a false beard and a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles, to say nothing of that pestle-shaped weapon of hard rubber. So that's how I was able to include the list of those things as waiting for you in Pleadle's rooms in the envelope I gave Sir Paul beforehand. Yes, and there we found them, right enough, admitted Moresby readily, though, as you said, they weren't much in the way of real proof. But how did you get over his alibis, Mr. Sheringham? I don't understand that even now. How did he kill that girl in Pelham Mansions at the same time as he was eating lunch with you at your club? Roger took a pull at the tankard by his side. Out in the world, a grandmotherly government was forbidding its citizens to quench their noble thirsts with good 4X. In the Albany, with the help of a nice round-bellied cask, such feeble puerilities could be disregarded. "Fill up, you two," said Roger. "There's a gallon or two left, and I hate stale beer. I'm going to begin at the beginning, so fortify yourselves." With happy grins, the two representatives of the same grandmotherly government took the necessary steps towards fortifying themselves. "Monte Carlo is the beginning," said Roger, "so I'll begin there. Well, the truth is that there never was a murder at Monte Carlo at all. The French police were right. That was a perfectly genuine suicide. So there goes alibi number one. But that was what gave Plato his idea. He arrived just afterwards, you remember, and must have heard plenty of talk about it. The thing tickled his imagination. He may have been overworking, or his health may have been bad. Anyhow, he had probably got into a queer state. You can picture him brooding over that girl hanging on the door by one of her own stockings. He loved it. Nothing would satisfy him but that he must see such a thing happen. So the first thing he does when he gets back to England is to do it. You must remember that Plato suffered badly from megalomania. I noticed that on several occasions. If I say a thing is, then it is. If I say the impossible shall be done, then it shall. But he was so quiet about it, while the usual megalomaniac is so bombastic that one simply didn't recognize it for what it was. Anyhow, that gave him the idea that all was possible to him, that if it amused him to see girls die in this way, then it was only right that girls should die for his pleasure, and that, of course, he could never be suspected, much less found out. I was with him once in the street when we met Miss Carruthers, and was rather surprised to find that he knew her. It turned out, however, that he was financially behind the show she's in. It never occurred to me at the time, but of course there was his connection with Unity Ransom. Perhaps he didn't even go to Sutherland Avenue with the idea of killing her. He may have seen his opportunity and just taken it. Probably that is what happened. As for the note left in that case, and the next, I can't tell you exactly how he induced the girls to write them, but you can picture well enough the sort of thing that must have happened. Perhaps he offered them a new fountain pen and wanted to see how it suited their writing. Perhaps he was pretending to tell their characters from their handwriting. Anything like that. All we can say definitely is that he dictated and induced them, somehow or other, to take down his words verbatim. But it evidently wasn't easy, because in the last case, where he had no time to waste, he contented himself with cutting out a verse from a handy volume of poetry. Well, the death of Janet Manners whetted his appetite. He stood off for 6 weeks. Then he went for that poor little prostitute, Elsie Benham. That, of course, was his safest line. There's no connection to be traced in those cases at all. But I don't expect he was worrying about being traced. He would be immune from that sort of thing. And so next, we have him actually killing his own fiancée. Now that I do not see how anyone could be expected to tumble to, Mr. Sheringham, said Moresby, without much grammar, but with considerable feeling. Why not? Roger retorted. Neither of us did, as it happens, but that was because we both fell into the same error. We assumed that the engagement was a happy one. As a matter of fact, it wasn't anything of the kind. That never came out at the inquest, of course, but it was common gossip among their own small circle of intimates. That complete idiot Newsom only thought to mention it to me at 1 a.m. this morning, after I'd been questioning him about the two of them for a couple of hours on end. But you made a worse mistake than I did, because when you heard that Newsom and Lady Ursula had been very thick at one time, you thought that her subsequent engagement to Plato gave Newsom a motive for killing her. Knowing Newsom, I never thought that. What it actually did was give Plato the motive." The assistant commissioner, who had heard all this before, nodded sagely. "From what I can gather," Roger went on, "Lady Ursula was always in love with Newsom and engaged herself to Plato in sheer desperation when she became convinced that Newsom wasn't in love with her. He had no idea of this, of course, and hasn't now, but it's quite plain to me. Well, that didn't make for a happy engagement, did it? As I see it, they were continually quarreling, and Lady Ursula was always on the verge of breaking it off till they fell in with each other that night. Plato never had a real alibi for that night, you remember, and had one final grand bust-up when Lady Ursula, very nervy and suffering from a bad headache, finally gave him his congé. Probably they went into that studio to have their quarrel in private, and Plato, his megalomania utterly outraged, simply took what he considered the proper steps to restore it to self-respect. There was a struggle in that case because he hadn't got his weapon with him, and he had to tie her wrists and ankles, and no doubt he gagged her in the way I first suggested, Moresby, when we reconstructed the case, if you remember." Moresby nodded. "Yes, I remember. With a scarf or something like that, you said. But what about the note, Mr. Sheringham?" "Ah, yes, that note," Roger smiled. "I felt in my bones all the time that the note was taking you on the wrong track, Moresby, but you wouldn't listen. You see, one thing struck me forcibly about that note, but I didn't mention it to you because I knew you wouldn't pay any attention. It was the way it was folded. You pointed out that the main fold didn't come in the middle, and so something must have been cut off the top. But you quite missed the point later on that, if it was the man for whom it had been left who made use of it afterwards, the fold would have been in the center because he would have cut the top off before he folded it, not after. That told me, as soon as I heard from the valet that the note had not been left in an envelope, that it was not the man for whom it had been left who used it, but someone else who had got possession of it, folded it, and carried it off before cutting it. You see?" "Oh, Mr. Sheringham, come," expostulated Moresby. "That's too subtle altogether." "That's exactly what I knew you'd say," Roger replied equably. "So I didn't say it. But I deduced from that subtle bit of reasoning that somebody might be in illegal possession of one of Newsom's keys. And lo, when I questioned his valet, I found that one of his keys actually was missing. Newsom had had his pocket picked some weeks ago and his keys and wallet stolen. It was Plato, of course, looking for letters from Lady Ursula, and no doubt he thought the keys would come in uncommonly handy, too. The truth is patent enough if one reads between the lines. Plato knew all about Newsom and Lady Ursula, and he was mad jealous of Newsom. He was always trying to get some evidence that the two were on more intimate terms than those of happy-go-lucky friendship. Hence the pocket-picking. I've no doubt he was in the habit of shadowing Lady Ursula. At any rate, he must have seen her go into Newsom's flat the day before the murder. That may have clinched his suspicions. We can't tell. Anyhow, as soon as the valet was out of the way, he went in too, with that handy key, and found the note. He took it, seeing at once the use to which he could put it if occasion arose. Oh, Moresby, why didn't you take a hint from me and try what would happen if one assumed that Newsom was speaking the truth and it was the facts, not he, that were at fault? Well, I don't know whether Plato realized at the time, though he certainly did later, that he had, wittingly or unwittingly, built up a very pretty case against Newsom. The next thing to do was to develop it, and so we come to the last murder. So far, we've had murders with two different motives. Out of the series of 4, only the first 2 were pure lust murders. Lady Ursula's was a vengeance murder, or a megalomania murder, if you like. The last was a murder committed with the sole motive of increasing the strength of the case against the man he loathed. by being preferred to himself in Lady Ursula's affections. You see, Newsom had committed the unforgivable sin. He must be eliminated at all costs, and very cunningly the trap was laid. Here Roger paused to prevent a little more beer from going stale. Pleadle was a cunning man, you see. Oh, very cunning. Do you know what brought him to Scotland Yard, Moresby? Not any vague suspicions, as we thought at the time, but that paragraph in the Evening Clarion which you showed me, saying that the police were taking an interest in Lady Ursula's death and hinting at exciting developments. Pleadle knew well enough that the police don't take an interest in death unless something like murder is suspected. He did a bit of hard thinking, put himself in our minds, and proceeded to act precisely as we should expect him to. And very well he played his part, too. But he wanted more than that. He wanted to be kept abreast of our investigations and know every minute just what we thought, were doing, and were going to do. And there I admit frankly that I was the mug. I offered him what he wanted with both hands. Well, Pleadle didn't mind the police investigations, not he. He welcomed it, and it amused him terribly. There was no question that he himself could ever be suspected, you see, and now he could go right ahead with his case against Newsom. And he went. Having worked out his plot, he proceeded to put it into operation. He went in disguise to a girl in one of his shows. Did you know he was behind her husband's wife, too? I found that out from Miss Deeping on the telephone last night, so that he wouldn't be recognized if seen outside. Rang her bell, whipped off the disguise, and went in. No doubt he'd telephoned to her in advance or knew in some other way that the coast was perfectly clear till well after lunch. Well, he'd worked out a very clever alibi and had no time to waste. The first thing he does is to tell the girl that a friend of his called Gerald Newsom is extremely interested in her. All this is only guesswork, of course, but it must be near enough to the facts. And has consulted him about putting up the money for a show in which she would be the star. Of course, he'd have chosen a girl who did know Jerry. Newsom has said something about taking her out to lunch that day to discuss the proposition. Has she heard from him? No, says the girl, thoroughly excited. She hasn't. Then if I were you, I should ring him up at once and clinch it, says Pleadle, and tell him 1 o'clock, not earlier, because I want to talk it over with you myself till then. And naturally, the girl promptly does it. So there is Newsom's presence, guaranteed for 1 o'clock, with the certainty that the porter will see him enter. I was assuming, by the way, that Pleadle knew enough about Pelham Mansions to have heard about that porter. That also was confirmed last night, as I'll explain later. Now, this next bit of deduction, I must tell you, is one that I really am proud of. It's all based on those dints in the girl's legs. I'd already made up my mind, you see, that the solicitor-looking man was the murderer, and his trimmings were a disguise, though I hadn't the least idea then who he was. But I was sure that his object was to establish an alibi, and I had become convinced independently that the girl was alive inside when Newsom rang the bell, but under forcible restraint. I shouldn't say deductions, by the way. This was pure induction. I took these various assumptions and deliberately built up my case to prove them. Very naughty, wasn't it, Moresby? Putting myself in his place, then, I asked myself, how could I cause that girl to die exactly 3/4 of an hour after I was safely out of the way? That puzzled me for some time, till I began to wonder, wasn't there some method by which, having made her unconscious, I could place her in such a physical position that the very act of regaining consciousness would make her bring about her own death? To have thought of that question was the great step. The answer soon came. Yes, by stunning her with some yielding instrument on the principle of the sandbag by means of a blow hard enough to keep her unconscious for an hour or so without cracking her skull. That would leave no bruise, you see, and would be quite undiscoverable at a post-mortem unless the actual brain were examined, which would be highly unlikely. I needn't explain to you experts, of course, that a blow with an instrument of that nature stuns by bruising the brain, which, being a little loose inside the skull, is thrown violently against the bone on the farther side. I didn't actually hit on the idea of hard rubber as the material then, but of course, when Miss Manners explained to me later the short glimpse she had caught of the weapon which stunned her, I realized what it must be. Well, having stunned her in that way, with a blow sufficiently forcible to keep her unconscious for about an hour, the next thing he could do, I imagined, would be to prop her on the back of a chair, leaning back and balanced against an open door, with the stocking already in position around her neck and fastened to the hook, and the chair tilted in such a way that the slightest movement would destroy the balance of the whole erection. The door would then swing to, you see. The chair, on whose back she was half sitting, half lying, would follow it, sinking gradually to the floor as the door closed, and the girl would be left hanging. And the particular beauty of the plan is that the first movement made by a person who has been knocked out is a rolling of the head, which would affect nothing. But the second is a sort of stretching movement of the legs and the body. I've been knocked out myself more than once, and I know. The latter movement, of course, would cause her feet to press on the seat of the chair, which would at once push herself and the door away from it. The next impulse, by the way, is to be sick, but the immediate strangulation would prevent that. "And you worked all that out just from those dints in her legs, Mr. Sheringham?" asked Superintendent Green, with real respect at last. "More or less," said Roger proudly, "together with the particular chair he used, with a very high back, and the fact that she was not wearing her wrapper. If he had gone to the trouble of removing that from her, it must have been with some particular reason, and the only reason I could see was that it was getting in the way of whatever he wanted to do with her. And what is more, Superintendent and Chief Inspector both, having worked it out, I went round to the flat to examine the door for the 2 tiny dints which the knobs on either side of the chair back should have made in the paintwork, and the infinitesimal scratches they ought to have left as they slithered down to the floor. And there I found them." "Well," said the superintendent, nobly burning all his boats, "that's as clever a piece of reasoning as ever I heard." "Thank you," said Roger, "and all by the inductive method, which you people don't use. By the way, one other thing had occurred to me. A limp body is a difficult thing to balance like that, and I thought he would anticipate some difficulty in preventing the door from shutting prematurely. What, in that case, would be better than a nut wedged in between the frame and the door? It would hold the balance, you see, and yet crack when the extra pressure was applied. And there, in the dust at the bottom, I found the fragments of a walnut shell." "Well, I'll be blowed," quoth Chief Inspector Moresby. Expanding like a flower before the warmth of these official compliments, Roger continued. "And it was the wrapper, I should add, which told me that Platyl's first action on getting inside the flat was to tell her the exciting news connected with Newsom, and that he struck her down as soon as she'd hung up the telephone receiver. That was a simple deduction from what Miss Deeping had to say about the habits of her friend concerning visitors and wrappers. Well, that was that. All the murderer had to do then was to put on his disguise again and walk out, and his alibi was established by the porter. At first, when I began to realize that the solicitor was our man, I had thought that, knowing the habits of the porter, he had sneaked back as soon as the latter had gone to lunch. But I was right in thinking I had made a mistake there, and the man wanted not only the porter's negative evidence, but somebody else's positive testimony as well. I provided the latter for him by paying for his lunch, and when Newsom rang the bell later, according to plan, the girl was still alive inside. Could anything have been neater? and the case against Newsom after that was nothing less than glaring, as Plato knew it would be. And that brings us to the attack on Miss Manners yesterday. Plato would have been better advised to forego that. It gave him away at last. And the curious thing is that, lost to everything else as the girl lay helplessly at his mercy, he not only forgot to give the 10-minute signal himself, as of course he intended, but actually stepped on his own alarm bell. Could anything be more ironical? What a perfect mixture of superhuman cunning and complete idiocy. Yes, that last attempt was a real madman's effort. He realized, of course, as soon as he'd done it, and darted out to hide on the lower landing till I had fled past. But by that time, he'd spoilt his own game. At first, I was hopelessly at sea. I'd never expected for a moment to get any results with such a poor little trap for such a very clever spider. I began by thinking that it must be one of our 5 suspects, and wondered if it really could be Beverly, as Miss Manners had told me the same morning. This attack cleared up certain points on which I had been still doubtful, and confirmed others. It definitely settled the question of the weapon, and explained the absence of any struggle, except in Lady Ursula's case. It also showed that I had been wrong in my first reconstruction regarding the scarf, but that did not help much. Then it occurred to me that there might be a double object in this case, not only to eliminate Miss Manners, but also to throw still further suspicion on Newsom, for I was convinced by this time that somebody was deliberately trying to do just that thing, and with a malicious vindictiveness that argued a substantial motive. Did that give me a pointer? Who had anything against Newsom? So far as I could see, only Plato. And as I told you, I laughed at myself. Then I thought, why should anyone want to eliminate Miss Manners? Even if the existence of our trio of inquiry were known, she was the least important member of it. Why not eliminate Plato or myself? Could there possibly be any reason for her elimination beyond her membership of our trio? Because it was clear that this was not a haphazard attack, or so I thought. There was some hidden reason for it, and at once I remembered a conversation she had had with me that same morning. Briefly, she had suggested then a new line of inquiry, to put out feelers as to whether a man, not answering to Newsom's description but wearing a beard and gold-rimmed glasses, had been seen in the neighborhood of Miss McLean's studio after the crime. That was significant, you see, and she had already arrived at the independent conclusion that the bearded man at Pelham Mansions was the real murderer, though she thought he was Arnold Beverly, and I had an open mind. But what now occurred to me as in the highest degree interesting was that she had mentioned this to Plato earlier in the morning, and he had as good as asked her not to say anything about it to me, and had got her to agree that it would be fun to follow it up behind my back. You see, there was evidently something in it, and he didn't want it investigated. Moreover, he had heard her say the day before that she had a new idea and that we had been blind, and she had promised to tell me after tea the next day. If Plato were the murderer, I thought, that would give him a real motive for getting rid of her before she had told me anything. Well, that put me on to the idea of Plato in real earnest, and immediately things began to fall into their places. Plato was not in his office in the city when we rang him up immediately after the attack. Why not? Because he was in Maida Vale. He arrived in Sutherland Avenue much quicker than he could have done from his board meeting. Why? Because he was so anxious to see if he were suspected after the incident of the alarm bell. His first action on being alone with me was vehemently to accuse Newsom afresh. Why? To put me off himself. And one of the first things he said was that it must be Newsom, because he was the only one who knew. Why did he say that? Newsom wasn't. Plato really had passed the word to the other suspects about the sittings. But what was significant was that Plato was the only one who knew that Newsom was on the premises. And there were hundreds of other little things of the same kind, not only in that case, but in all the others. In fact, once I had begun to see seriously whether Plato would fit, he fitted everywhere. I spent an interesting 10 minutes soothing him by pretending to agree about Newsom and doing my utmost to get the girls out of his clutches. I told him I was going to take them to the Piccadilly Palace, where doubtless he would have followed and attacked Miss Manners again in the middle of the night. But when we got there, I told the others to wait in the taxi while I booked their rooms. Then I ran inside, waited a minute, and ran out to tell them that the place was full. I didn't want them to suspect Plato, you see, because I wasn't sure, but I did want to get those two safe inside the Albany for the night. Well, if I wasn't sure before dinner, I was after. Apart from the few but very significant things I found out from Newsom and on the telephone, I got a report I'd asked for about the other inhabitants of Pelham Mansions. One of the girls there was reputed to be kept by Plato. That, to my mind, clinched it. Then I was up against the problem of proving it, and there was no real proof. At least none that could not quite easily be explained away. I was morally convinced, but what, as Moresby says, is the good of that? And as for attempting to assemble any convincing proofs within 18 hours to prevent you people from arresting Newsom, well, I ask you. So I thought of the usual French method of reconstructing the crime and testing the suspect's reactions, and wondered whether anything could be done in that line. And the more I thought of it, the more I was sure not only that it was the only possible way, but that some sort of reaction might be confidently expected if we made the scene convincing and horrible enough. So I hit on that quite impossible plan, and listed plucky little Miss Manners, to whom, and that undeserving Jerry Newsom who's going to get her, I drain this tankard, cajoled Scotland Yard into sitting through the performance, forced myself through quite the most unpleasant 10 minutes of my life, and there we are. Oh, and of course, I couldn't warn Plato, even by innuendo, what the real object of the mummery was, and so I had to spin that yarn about a representative gathering of citizens and all that nonsense. That's all. But I do wish Plato hadn't gone quite mad at the end. I should like to have had a chance to probe into his mind a little further first. His psychology, of course, is absorbing. I don't suppose for a moment that he considered himself a murderer, you know. He killed, but he didn't murder. His mind, when the action was applied to himself, is sure to have conceived some subtle differentiation. And he really had rather a nice sense of humor, you know, with it all. He must have been hugging himself all this time, not only looking on at the futile hunt for himself, but even assisting in it. How his tongue must have been in his cheek when I think of some of the things he's said to me. Well, it's a pity that quite the most interesting brain that any of us is likely to meet has turned out to be a mad one. But I suppose one can't have everything, and that really does appear to be all. The remaining contents of the tankard descended the way of all good beer. Faculus descensus taverni, said Roger, smacking his lips. He looked round at the three thoughtful faces and grinned widely. He was feeling rather more pleased with Roger Sheringham than ever before, and he wanted a victim. Moresby was the selection. Roger felt he owed Moresby just what the chief inspector was going to get. He rose and clapped him happily on the shoulder. "Do you know what's the matter with you real detectives at Scotland Yard, Moresby?" he asked kindly. "You don't read enough of those detective stories." End of chapter 25. End of The Silk Stocking Murders by Anthony Berkeley.